Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we saw the Granville Street Bridge blocked for a few hours. Thousands of people were marooned downtown, including my own family members, stuck in buildings that they couldn't exit even through the fire exits. Today, we hear that the Attorney General's office has been occupied on Broadway in Vancouver, and we also understand that there's been a complete blockage at UBC, where the occupying group has issued a statement that says, universities have long served as engines of genocide, producing Eurocentric knowledge and a colonial elite intent on eliminating Indigenous people altogether. These are the people we're dealing with who are obstructing our society. And so the question obviously arises. The Premier has announced that he's sending the Minister for Indigenous Relations up to Smithers or Houston to deal with this. He's still sitting here in the room, so we wonder what's actually happening today. It appears to be nothing whatsoever is being done. And in the meantime, our infrastructure is being slowly gridlocked and shut down. And we've also heard that the Premier of Manitoba has taken the initiative to apply for an injunction to clear the rail tracks to let commerce continue in Manitoba. So in the face of all this and the stated need to maintain the rule of law, we have an entirely passive approach from the Premier in the face of implacable protesters who are intent on shutting down constituency services, shutting down the university, shutting down our transportation arteries. And so will the Premier rise in this House and tell us what he's going to do that is anything more than passive?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the Leader of the Opposition wants to highlight the conflict in constituencies. They wants to highlight the conflict across the country. And I think that's what separates me from he, and as much as I want to try and address these issues in a thoughtful and compassionate way, not to just be hyperbolic, not to just say that it's all someone's fault. These issues have been emerging over 150 years, and I'm confident the member understands that they won't be resolved with more force. I believe the vast majority of British Columbians and Canadians agree with me and with him that this is inappropriate behaviour. But we can't just say, Honourable Speaker, that inappropriate behavior should be dealt with by force. It needs to be dealt with by cooperation, by consultation, by discussion, so that we can all move forward together. I thought we'd agreed on that with respect to Indigenous rights just last fall.
Leader of the Official Opposition on a supplemental.
Well, with that evasive and conciliatory answer, the Premier neglects the fact that it was him who said a scant 2 weeks ago that we must maintain the rule of law in this society. That's what the courts are for, Premier. That's why Premier Pallister in Manitoba has gone through the Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench to get the appropriate injunction. It is incumbent on this government to use the courts where appropriate, like infrastructure being blocked, like universities being shut down, like constituency offices being blockaded and occupied. That is the role of the courts. It's not a matter of some police state where the dictator calls in the police to crack heads. This is a matter of using the vehicles of the courts to maintain the rule of law. Why won't this Premier obtain injunctions to clear these protests like the Premier of Manitoba?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And as a learned lawyer, he would know that you don't need injunctions when unlawful activity is taking place. Law enforcement has appropriate skills and abilities to address these issues. I am dumbfounded that the backbench of the BC Liberal Party assumes that law enforcement is not doing their job. Of course they are, and what they need is the support of this place, not criticism.
Member Prince George Valemount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What British Columbians need is a Premier who's going to stand up on behalf of all British Columbians, take some action, and actually do something. As the Premier sits here As the Premier sits here in the legislature today, British Columbians are watching as ports, bridges, and other critical infrastructure is blocked. As we speak, a rail blockade in northern BC is stopping companies from shipping their goods, whether it's lumber, whether it's grain, and other commodities. To quote the president of CN Rail, the port of Prince Rupert is effectively already shut down. And what do we hear from this Premier? Nothing. There are 6,000 jobs at risk. When will this Premier get up, do his job, and seek an injunction to remove the rail blockade?
Members, Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for her passion. This is an issue that's being addressed by CN. It's also being addressed by the Prime Minister and myself. Both of us have written to the hereditary leadership in the Gitxsan territory and agreed that we would be happy to meet with them, sent government representatives at the earliest opportunity. That's action. But it's CN's responsibility to clear unlawful behaviour on their right-of-way, and they're undertaking that. Again, another former Attorney General, 2 in a row, back-to-back, Liberal Attorney Generals getting up and saying, do something, when they know darn well that we are doing everything that we can to support law enforcement, and the right way forward. When the people of British Columbia look at the behaviour on that side of the House, they shake their heads and say, thank goodness the erratic people on that side are not trying to move forward in a situation that was not created yesterday, was not created 2 years ago, was created 150 years ago. I thought we had agreed unanimously.
Members.
I thought we had agreed unanimously that we were going to work on these issues together. Apparently, that doesn't matter to the people on that side of the House.
Member Prince George Valemont on a supplemental.
You're totally passive on this file. You're just sitting here. He's sitting here doing nothing in the face of economic shutdown.
Members,
He's sitting here doing nothing.
Leader of the Official Opposition, you're out of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier can stand in this House and try passing the buck all he wants, but let's be clear, the responsibility for upholding the rule of law rests on his shoulders as the Premier of British Columbia. And to suggest he has done everything he can is simply false. Apparently, the Premier of Manitoba has figured out that there's a tool he can use. Why isn't our Premier standing up and following that example? Job creators have grave concerns, and the Premier knows that. And recently they said they cannot continue to afford this government's lack of involvement. In fact, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce appealed on Thursday to all levels of government, including this one, that law enforcement needs to restore rail service by removing the blockades. Industry leaders are concerned. The Premier knows that. British Columbians expect action. The Premier knows that. So will the Premier stand up today and follow the example of the Premier of Manitoba and seek an injunction to end the rail blockade?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, perhaps the news service isn't making its way to the basement of the BC Liberal Caucus. CN has sought an injunction. It will be enforced by law. It will be. It will be enforced by law enforcement as they are able to do so. Those operational decisions, as again she should well know as a former Solicitor General and Attorney General, will be done on their terms, not on terms in this legislature. And I will add that to cast aspersions at the Minister of Reconciliation for sitting here in this House and doing his job is absolutely outrageous. You know full well he was in Wet'suwet'en territory. He has crisscrossed this province, building relations with Indigenous people so we can move together in prosperity for all British Columbians, not just the rich friends that back your party.
Members. House Leader, third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Over the last several weeks, this government has spoken at great length about about the work that it has done with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. Our concern is that this engagement has been secondary to ensuring that LNG Canada and its associated projects can proceed. Late last month, it was reported that a key environmental assessment report that is necessary for construction to proceed in the Morris River Technical Boundary Area, the same area that includes the Unistoten Healing Centre, still needed to be submitted and approved. The ministry was quoted in the media as stating that, quote, "This process is part of our work to ensure that industry, in this case Coastal GasLink, is meeting the requirements of their environmental approval. Environmental Assessment Office requirements will need to be met for CGL to proceed with construction," end quote. My question, through you, Honourable Speaker, is for the Minister of Environment. What steps did this government take to work with the federal government and with CGL to hold off seeking an extension of their injunction in order to allow more engagement with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, particularly since the missing report meant that no construction could take place in the Morris River area anyway?
Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Strategy.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. As the member knows, the Environmental Assessment Certificate for Coastal GasLink contains 33 legally binding conditions. It was issued in 2014. The first condition, the member is correct, addresses the Morris River Technical Boundary Area, which includes the Wilderness Lodge and the Healing Centre. On November 2019, CGL submitted the required report to the Environmental Assessment Office, and the Environmental Assessment Office is currently reviewing the report submitted by the company. As part of that review, it is consulting and seeking feedback extensively from all parties, including both the hereditary and the elected leadership of the Wet'suwet'en. Since the Environmental Assessment Certificate was granted, the EAO has met directly with the Office of the Wet'suwet'en on a number of times to hear the specific concerns that they raised. To the details of the member's question, under the terms of the Environmental Assessment Certificate and British Columbia law, the company, CGL, cannot undertake construction activity in the Morris River Technical Boundary Area until the report has been accepted and that condition is deemed to have been met. They can, however, undertake construction in other areas covered by other terms and conditions, and they can, as has been affirmed by the courts, have access to those areas through that area, and that is where the matter currently stands.
House Leader, third party on a supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. As my colleague from Saanich North and the Islands made clear yesterday, the issue that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have raised is not new. The immediate issues concerning the Coastal GasLink pipeline have been known for years. The broader territorial rights and title issue have been known for decades. Even with the injunction, we have had a long lead up to what is before us. An interim injunction was first granted on December 14th, 2018, and it was on December 31st, 2019 that the BC Supreme Court granted an extension of the injunction to completion. And yet, it was only at the beginning of this month that the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation sat down at the respect table to seek peaceful resolution. My question through you, Honourable Speaker, is for the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Given almost everyone involved in the respect table discussions has described it as a positive step and constructive in the reconciliation process, why did it take the threat of a pending injunction enforcement for a respect table discussion to be struck, especially given how long government has been aware of the outstanding issues related to this pipeline?
Minister, Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the House Leader for the third party for her question. As a member notes, that the situation is very complex and it's very long-standing. As a matter of fact, it long predates our government. We've been engaging in meaningful government-to-government negotiations with the Office of Wet'suwet'en since last spring. I was grateful to have been invited to a smoke feast in the territory by the chiefs as the first formal step in that process. As the member also knows, there had been access agreement in place between the company, the RCMP, and the hereditary chiefs since last January. But with the BC Supreme Court ruling on the injunction, the agreement ended. So since then, our government made a committed effort to work with the OW, the Office of Wet'suwet'en, the hereditary chiefs, to find a peaceful resolution, including the talks at the respect table. Now, Weegoose is the hereditary, is the term that was explained by the hereditary chiefs when we were there. It was clear from the discussions that all of us came together in good faith, and that good faith continues, and we remain committed to continuing to build that relationship together.
Richmond, Queensborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, what we have witnessed the last few days is not some spontaneous uprising, but a well-funded and coordinated national strategy to shut down vital infrastructure and inconvenience the public. Presently, protesters are blockading a road at UBC, and initial reports also show that protesters have entered the Attorney General's constituency office. My understanding is his constituency assistant needed a police escort to remove sensitive documents from his office. So the Attorney General has lost control of his community office to radical activists. These same activists also disrupted goods and services and people at the Swartz Bay Terminal on January 20th, Delta Port and Port of Vancouver February 8th and 9th, Vancouver City Hall February 9th, Johnson Street Bridge and Bay Street Bridge February 10th, Helijet Victoria Terminal February 11th, Vancouver Cambie intersection February 11th, Granville Street Bridge yesterday, and tomorrow we have a planned shutdown of government offices. It doesn't end there, Mr. Speaker. I have a letter here from Ken Veldman. He's Vice President at the Prince Rupert Port. That port has been severely impacted by these very actions as well. So I want to read a quote from his letter. He says, quote, "Operations are being wound down at the Port of Prince Rupert, with terminals receiving no rail and working with current cargoes on hand and capacities available. Terminal operations are being severely curtailed, labour is not being called in, and the situation is expected to deteriorate even more in the next couple of days, and will likely cascade into BC and Canadian exporters curtailing operations in multiple industries, including mills and mines. Moreover, full recovery of the terminals, gateway and railway network from this disruption will take months even after service is resumed." End quote. Mr. Speaker, to this Premier, I would say his job is not a passive role. It's not passive at all. Preserving the rule of law is his responsibility. Will the Premier stand up for the hardworking men and women of BC and bring back the rule of law?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And I guess the word of the day for the Liberals on their word of the day calendar was passive, because I've heard it a few times. And I just want to say to all members of this House and all British Columbians that I don't believe there's a person in this room who doesn't believe that unlawful behaviour requires consequences. And I think everyone also understands that law enforcement, in the face of illegal behaviour, has every tool at their disposal to take action. With respect to the port of Prince Rupert, a federal port, I have been in contact with the Deputy Prime Minister last evening. I'll be speaking with the Prime Minister at the end of question period today. And together we have reached out to the Gitxsan leadership and urge them to leave the tracks. The CN Rail Company has sought an injunction, as they rightly should. Again, I believe every step is being taken to preserve lawful behaviour in British Columbia, and it does not in any way assist the people of British Columbia to have an opposition that prefers to give an inventory of illegal behaviour and say, what's the deal with that? If they just woke up yesterday, sometimes, Honourable Speaker, when I think of things like ICBC, when I think of how they drove that corporation into the ground, and they go, hey, it wasn't us, we just showed up 2 years ago. We just arrived 2 years ago. These issues have been percolating for generations, and I think it's appropriate for reasonable leaders
Members.
to band together to say with one voice, illegal behavior is unacceptable. Let law enforcement do its job. Let the courts do what they're supposed to do, and we'll move on from there. But it does not help. It does not help. It does not help when a pathetic opposition tries to find a way to sow discontent rather than to find the harmony that, again, I thought we had not that many months ago.
So, members, if we could get back to question period. Member Richmond, Queensborough.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to read a quote from a politician not making excuses. Here's Brian Pallister, and this is what he had to say. Quote, "As much as we will always respect the right of protesters to have a voice, they don't have a veto, and they don't have the right to put their rights ahead of everyone else and to disregard the laws of our province." End quote. Mr. Speaker, blocking critical infrastructure cannot be tolerated. So can the Premier please get off his duff and do something?
Members, Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, I want to thank the member, the future leader of the official opposition, for his question. I'm confident that latest intervention will get him up the top of the news on Global, where he never seemed to be when he worked there, but that's okay. That's okay. I appreciate I had a lot to say.
Members.
I am doing my job, member.
Members, order, please. Members, order. Premier.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, I've answered the question. We're working with law enforcement, we're working with the federal government on these issues, and more importantly, we're working with people across British Columbia to try and find a way forward. No one accepts unlawful behavior. I was pretty clear on that yesterday. I'll be clear on that every single day that I'm in this position. It's not acceptable to intrude on the liberty and rights of other people when you're expressing your discontent with a policy question. And that is a pretty fundamental part about being Canadian citizens. I know the members on that side agree with me. They should put the politics aside. Why don't we band together for a better outcome for all British Columbia?
Member Kamloops, South Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Under the Housing Minister's watch, British Columbia's strata market is in crisis. There have been massive spikes in insurance premiums and deductibles. This is hurting British Columbians in Metro Vancouver and elsewhere. Premiums are going up between 50 and 400%. Deductibles are going
Members. Thank you.
Deductibles are going up from 50 or 25% to as high as 750,000, 25,000 to 750,000. So a simple question to the Minister of Housing would be this. What is she planning to do to help those thousands of British Columbians who are hurting from skyrocketing strata costs?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Certainly, we're very concerned about the impact of the insurance increases for strata owners, but also for tenants, because many tenants rent through stratas, and we're worried that those costs will be passed on to them. So we're taking a look at the challenges that are being faced right now. We are working with the BC Financial Services Authority, who regulates insurance companies. As the member knows well, this is private industry, and they are facing, as they've raised challenges around climate, challenges around increasing real estate prices, but we are working with the strata associations, we are working with individuals, and we're working with the insurance corporation as well, insurance companies, to be able to take a look at options that are available to be able to ease the pressure. This is not unique to British Columbia. I think that's important to note. This is a common problem that is happening across the country right now, but it's important that we look at how we can address the affordability issues for the individuals concerned.
Here, here.
Member Kamloops, South Thompson on a supplemental. Members, the member from Kamloops, South Thompson has the floor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Housing is the individual in this chamber who's responsible for the Strata Act. That's the person I have asked the question to. She is the minister who, under her watch, over the last 2.5 years, rents have shot up. So you're darn right renters are concerned. In fact, in Metro Vancouver, the average renters are paying $2,064 more per year under the NDP than they did before the NDP came to town. So now we're talking about layering on a whole other level of unaffordability for renters and for anyone in the strata market, Mr. Speaker. Anyone who lives in a condo, anyone who lives in a townhome, anyone who lives in an apartment a duplex is at risk. We're talking about half of the citizens of Metro Vancouver that this potentially impacts. People are worried about this, and they deserve and expect action from this housing minister. So again, to the Minister of Housing, what is her specific plan to address these massive and unaffordable strata costs?
Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a bit rich that it's this member who's standing up asking an insurance question. Mr. Speaker.
Members.
Mr. Speaker, $2 billion. I would think everyone on that side should hang their heads in shame at $2 billion that could have been spent on services. If it wasn't for ICD. A mess left us by that member and by the previous side. We are talking to the insurance companies. We are talking to the Financial Services Authority, which is part of my mandate as Finance Minister. We are taking a look at insurance companies. We are talking with the strata owners as well to look at what solutions are possible, given the fact that, again, remember, this is an individual private industry decision that they make around prices. It's common across the country. We also are having conversations with our colleagues across the country because this is not unique to British Columbia, so we are talking to them as well. And we will continue as a government standing up for affordability for families, unlike the other side over there.
Members. Members, we don't want to change Thursdays to Testy Thursday. Member North Vancouver Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's a bit rich that the Minister of Finance is deflecting the importance of this issue on virtually half of the people that live in Metro Vancouver. Some people in my constituency are facing insurance rates that have gone double in 1 year. And you talk all you want about affordability, having insurance rates doubling in 1 year is actually the opposite of affordability. For a senior on fixed income who suddenly must pay hundreds of dollars more every month, this is a crisis that demands immediate action. Bruce Campbell is a Strata president who has this to say, and I quote, "I describe it as a crisis. There's no other way around it," end quote. And for this government to say it's going to monitor and hold consultations during a crisis simply is not good enough. Does the housing minister think this is a serious enough issue to intervene on behalf of Strata owners?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. I've answered the question, but I'm happy to answer it again. We are concerned for Strata owners. We are concerned for decisions that are being made right now by insurance companies when it comes to Strata costs. This is not a unique issue to British Columbia. This is an issue across the country. That's why we've had a call with our federal colleagues and provincial colleagues as well to talk about the pressures that are being faced. This relates to everything from rising real estate prices to climate action. Those are issues that certainly the insurance companies have been raising themselves. And so we will continue those discussions to look for solutions to be able to address this issue on behalf of those who are Strata owners.
The bell ends question period.